Afternoon. I think we're about to get started. I see some folks are still trickling in. It takes a moment with Zoom. But good afternoon and welcome to today's event focused on the Civil Rights Act of 1964, 60 years later, and where are we now? My name is Ted Wells. I'm president of STEMconnector, and it's my honor to introduce today's discussion that I'm sure will be informative and engaging, given the outstanding panelists that we have speaking. Just a little background on today's topic. My colleague Renee, who will be moderating today's discussion, and I were talking about potential themes back last year in 2023. And she and I were throwing ideas around, and she said, the Civil Rights Act will be 60 years next year. And I think there's been I think it's a good time to sort of take stock of where we've come and what needs to be done. And so we brought today's speakers together, and we were just having a good conversation in our virtual green room before this. And I think you're going to really be in for a treat today. Thank you again for joining, and I'm pleased to introduce Renee, who will be introducing our panelists. Renee's been with STEMconnector for 3 years this month, and in that time has become a very invaluable member of our team, supporting our client engagements, new partnership development, and coordinating both our in-person and virtual convenings. She has an extensive background supporting DEIB initiatives at both in the private sector and working for a PNC bank, for a realtor association, and also for a post-secondary institution. And she is just also a great colleague to have as well. So I think you're going to enjoy Renee today, keeping this discussion going. And I know this is an area where she brings a lot of passion to the discussion. So Renee, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Wow. Thank you, Ted, for that fantastic introduction. Well, hello, everyone, and thank you for spending the next hour with us to kick off Black History Month with a great conversation commemorating the 60th anniversary of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Where are we now? Black History Month is a time to reflect on our past and the progress we've made, and also a reminder of the work that still needs to be done. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 is the nation's benchmark civil rights legislation and continues to resonate in America to this day. The act prohibited discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. It was the first civil rights legislation passed by Congress since the Reconstruction Act following the Civil War. This landmark legislation is widely considered by historians to be one of the most significant legislative achievements in U.S. history. By outlawing discrimination on the basis of race, sex, religion, or national origin, the law aimed to ensure equal footing under the law for all citizens, not just a select few. As we reflect on the 60 years that have passed since the passage of the Civil Rights Act, results are mixed in terms of outcomes for those for whom the law was designed to support. Today's discussion will focus on highlighting the education advancement and challenges in education and the impact after 60 decades. I truly believe that understanding history can shape learning outcomes and improve engagement in STEM fields. It's an honor and privilege to moderate today's session with the following panel of experts. Dr. Calvin Mackie, founder and owner of STEM NOLA, Dr. Nicole Norfles, Director, Program Practice and Innovation at the Council for Opportunity in Education. So without further ado, I would like the audience to get to know Dr. Mackie and Dr. Norfles by introducing themselves and sharing with everyone their current roles and the important work they are doing at their organizations.
All right. First, let me say thank you, Renee. Thank you, Ted. I really appreciate being a part of this panel, and I want to acknowledge the great work that you're doing, as well as the great work that Dr. Mackie's doing. So it's a pleasure to, join you here for this session. My role, as mentioned, Director of Program Practice and Innovation at COE. What does that mean? Basically, I am part of the Professional Development Unit. COE works with TRIO programs. We provide college access and success. And so we have over 3,000 TRIO programs across the US. So in the unit I work with, it's providing professional development to the over 3,000 programs, which in the form of webinars, technical assistance, compliance, financial aid, legislation, regulations, things like that, to support those professionals so that they can then support their participants, their students. A little background how I got here, I'll be quick, is when I was a student activist when I was at Long Beach undergrad. I'm from California with the BSU, the party. And so I always felt an interest to serve my people, that when it came to, at that time, health, it was important to educate about health. So I tutored with a TRIO program, but didn't know it was TRIO at the time. And subsequently moving to DC, pursuing my doctoral degree, it was one of my professors on my dissertation committee who then referred me to COE. And so cut a lot of years there in terms of how I got here. Tom Willannon, which to the conversation about the Higher Education Act was a member, worked for a member of Congress, Representative Tom Ford, but he was the one who then pushed me to the council because of my interest to study why low-income students are not supported, more supported when it comes to financial support at institutions of higher ed with institutional funds. So even then during my doctorate, it was like, poor people need some money. We need to make sure we get access to these resources. So that kind of from early on, undergrad to graduate, kind of landed me here at COE, which the work, purpose, mission I love. So thank you.
Thank you for providing just some of your background and how you arrived at where you are now. That is so important that we hear your story. So thank you for providing that. Dr. Mackie?
Great. Again, thank you all for having me, Renee. Thank you, and Ted, thank you, and the STEMconnector for all the work that you do and also providing me this platform to have a voice. Nicole, the work that TRIO does in the lives of kids and families is transformative. So thank you for your work. How did I get here? I'm the CEO and founder of a community-based organization by the name of STEM NOLA. STEM NOLA was founded over 10 years ago to expose, inspire, and engage communities in hands-on science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. I'm a former engineering professor. I was a professor at Tulane University for 12 years, but in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, Tulane decided to keep the football team and eliminate the engineering program. So as the first and only African-American ever tenured in the history of the College of Engineering at Tulane University, I was summarily dismissed. And I'll never forget, one of my buddies called and he said, "Man, the only way you lose the tenured position is by act of God." I said, "Well, God decided to act. And God decided to kick me out." I said, "I'm gonna write a book called Kicked Out by Fate," because I always had an interest in working in the community and doing things that otherwise would give kids more access to things like STEM. So I saw this as an opportunity to do that. And one day my third grade son came home. He said, "Daddy, I don't like science anymore." He said, "The teacher just talked to the board." And I said, "Boy, that can't be right. It's in your DNA. When your mama was playing that classical music to her stomach, I was whispering Newton's 4 laws to her belly." And he said, "No, Daddy, I like to do stuff with my hands." And I said, "Well, we got to fix this, son." And I went in the garage. He and my other son, we started doing all these hands-on activities. Kids from the neighborhood started to come on Saturdays. And we saw how the kids were growing in confidence. We saw how their language was changing. And they was thirsting for this. And we realized then that we had something that we were giving our kids that other kids needed. My son came home another night. He had all A's. I said, "Now that's my boy." He said, "Dad, my friends want to know how I know all this." I said, "Well, did you tell them you do this with your dad in the garage?" He said, "Yeah, Dad, but my friends need this." Right then and there, he realized he was being exposed to people and things that his friends were not. And he really believed in his heart of hearts that if his friends had that exposure, they'd be just as bright as him. And I realized what I was doing in the garage, we had to take it to the community. So the 100,000 of our own dollars, my wife and I started STEM NOLA, and 10 years ago. And over 10 years, we've exposed over 150,000 young people, 30,000 families. We put over $4 million in the hands of college students because we train college students and then deploy them into the community. We've engaged over 3,000 professionals that we deploy in the community as volunteers. And we do vertical mentoring at STEM events so kids can see, touch, and feel real people and real technology and get the exposure that many middle and upper class kids are getting. So that's how I got here. I got kicked out of a university. So I left the university to create my own community.
Well, that's awesome. I love your story. Just touching so many people, right? Thank you for giving the audience those great facts and stories about you and your organization. But before we jump into the first series of questions for our experts, if you would like to submit a question during the webinar, please use the chat feature when doing so and specify who you would like your question to go to. And we'll use the time at the end of the webinar to ask your question. So feel free to sit tight, listen, learn, and if you feel that you would like to take it a step further and ask a question, you're more than welcome to do so. So to begin, I would like to pose the first few questions to both Dr. Mackie and Dr. Norfles. What are some most significant accomplishments in advancing the goals of the Civil Rights Act since 1964 in education? Specifically, in your view, what factors enable these advances?
Okay.
Ladies first?
Okay. All right. When I think back, many people reflect on the Brown v. Board of Education, that 2-year struggle in 54, the bus boycott in 55. But I also like to say, even as we look at the sit-ins between the late 50s and 64, sit-ins were happening in the 30s. So there's, history further back, there's been a long trajectory. Mm-hmm. So definitely the sit-ins. In 63, many people reflect on the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, but we have to remember too, Medgar Evers was murdered in 63. And then you had the March on Washington. Then you had the assassination of Kennedy. And with the assassination of Kennedy, while he had a lot of interest in creating the legislation, sadly, it was after his death with President Lyndon Baines Johnson that there was a political will to for those initiatives to cross the finish line to get that work done. Now, I might say that even after 64, okay, once the with the war on poverty, and the enactment of the Civil Rights Act, there were still a couple things that, once you've got this fire burning, it just doesn't go out. And so there was also the 65 farm workers movement, where again, alliance with Hispanic, Latinos, Filipinos, and even some African Americans. My father was a farm worker before he became a dry cleaner. You also had in 68, the Mexican American students that marched, walked out and marched as a result of poor education. And then of course in 68 was also the Poor People's Campaign, which created the interest for some to assassinate Martin Luther King. So when he shifted to poor people, that was a critical risk for people, because alliances of poor people can make a difference. So with that anxiety, I guess you could say, it allowed for the ushering in of not only the war on poverty, which is how Upward Bound came about, initially the war on poverty under the Economic Opportunity Act, but then 65, the Higher Education Act, which then created the Talent Search Program, and then the 1968 first reauthorization of the Higher Education Act then created the Student Support Services Program. And it was then that those three programs were then moved into what was then called it wasn't the Department of Education, it was Department of Education and Welfare. So they were moved there and known as the TRIO opportunity programs. So there was a lot going on in terms of that history, but particularly for TRIO programs, and even looking at the continued history of struggle. It kind of went into the late 60s and 70s even, I would say.
Dr. Mackie?
Great. I'm glad Dr. Flores brought up the fact that her father was a farm worker before he became a dry cleaner. And when we look at the Civil Rights Movement and the Civil Rights Act of 1964, sometimes we just only look at it through a social political lens. And there was a technological aspect to the Civil Rights Movement that I think people overlook. You know, in 1965, when President Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, people think that's when African Americans was freed from a slave economy. But in 1944, in Clarksdale, Mississippi, something transpired that really transformed this country. In 1944, 2,000 farmers showed up in the Delta of Mississippi to watch something called an automatic cotton picker. And this automatic cotton picker was able to pick one machine was able to pick the cotton of 100 sharecroppers. Between 1940 and 1970, 5 million African Americans left the South and migrated to the North. It increased the migration to the North, and that's when the Urban League really got its power, because their charge was to take in these migrant workers from the South and teach them and educate them on how to live in these northern industrial cities. But what was happening in these northern industrial cities? They were not hiring African Americans in these companies with jobs. So you had mass unemployment in major urban areas. As a matter of fact, in 1960, 24 Black workers was part of the 7,000 skilled workers at Chrysler. And at General Motors in 1960, 67 Blacks were among 11,000 skilled workers. I mean, we used to have the saying that Blacks was the last hired and the first fired. Well, during that time, many wasn't even being hired. So you had this rumbling going on about employment, about people being locked out, about people can't get in jobs. The only place people used to get jobs was in the public sector. As a matter of fact, that's why the Black community to this day, your parents used to always say, get you a good government job, because they have good benefits, right? Because they know if we can get us a government job, a public sector job, we would be safe. And all of that played into, the fact that, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 that was passed, that ended segregation in public places and prohibited discrimination based on race, ethnicity, religion, and national origin and sex in the workplace. And still, in 1970, people were still fighting to get equal access to corporations and private sector jobs that they otherwise could not get.
Well, I'll tell you, thank you so much for providing the significant accomplishments spanning from like 1964 and walking us through some of the accomplishments since the Civil Rights Act. And I think that's important because, and I love the fact that you touched on some of the history that we don't talk about, right? Especially some of the things that were going on when, a lot of the folks moved from the South, the migration to the North. I don't think we talk about that enough with our kids and just in classrooms across the board. So thank you for providing, just highlighting some of the accomplishments. But on the flip side, we know that there's significant work to be done as well. So what are some of the obstacles that have confronted progress?
I think, and I'll say this, in terms of political terms, what we talk about is, after elections, people have short memories. The polity doesn't remember, the month down the road or the prior year and what was going on. And so I think that's one of the challenges on the flip side as an obstacle. Because the era, what we're in today happened 100 years ago. I mean, Reconstruction was 1860s. You had Jim Crow, 1890s. And it took 60 years from Jim Crow you know, to the 50s, to the 60s, to again make change. And you mentioned that, you know, that piece of legislation last occurred, you know, during Reconstruction. And so even in 2000, it was Gary Orfield, used to be a faculty at Harvard and is at UCLA, talked about in early 2000s about the resegregation of schools. In 2000, that the US was on a 10-year trajectory, that in 10 years, since 1990, you could see this resegregation of schools by, you know, Black and brown and income. And so we were going backwards. So this is, in terms of obstacles, I would say that one of the key obstacles is that short memory and not, you know, continuing the fight, continuing understanding the value of education and how it benefits. You know, and let me say this one last thing. Right now we see in terms of news, there's this narrative about what is the value of college and do people need to go to college? Okay, that's always, you know, how has that become the question for us to respond to? When we know other people are going to college and bribing, you know, people to go to college and paying money for their students to get into colleges, you know, as though they were on sports teams or things like that. When did college become a negative thing? So again, I think it's about maintaining longer memories, understanding history, and refocusing on the value that education provides. Even the choice to go to college is a value.
Right, and we have to remember that, oh, I'm sorry, Renee.
No, I just agreed with Dr. Flores. But go ahead, Dr. Mackie, please.
You know, we have to remember policy is just that, it's policy, and all politics is local. So you have a federal policy that's put in place, but you have people at the local level fighting against that policy day in and day out, passing laws and you know, and creating obstacles to equal access for everybody, from the way they fund schools. I mean, before the Civil Rights Act, people through redlining, they created poor communities, primarily Black and brown communities. And then they passed laws that said schools should be funded by the taxes in that community. So if I was already discriminated against, put into a certain part of the city, you devalue the homes that in the community where I am, you'll make no investment to our community. Then you come out and assess the home, give me a lower asset assessment value, and then the taxes from that assessment value go to my community to fund my schools. So still, the schools are not funded as the way they should be funded. You would think schools would be funded straight across the board, you know, for everybody. And you know, even when we start talking about the remedy, when they passed the Civil Rights Act of 1964, then it was remedies, things put into place supposedly to correct this. And with the Supreme Court knocking down affirmative action, even to this day, there's a lot of affirmative rhetoric, but negative action in terms of giving equal access to everybody. The funny thing about it, I keep telling people, I have a son at Howard University, third-year mechanical engineering student, but I have a son at Yale. And my son at Yale, you know, every day he called me with this different story. He said, Dad, I got three roommates and all of them are legacy. You know, and all of them believe that they belong there. And they wondering, how in the hell did he get there without having legacy, right? Because he had to earn his way. And when you look at access and access to education, if you look over the last 20 years, again, I was just in California speaking to the Black administrators from the UC system. All of the UC schools has almost doubled the number of seats they've had in the last 20 years, creating more access for people to go to college. When you look at the Ivy League schools in the last 20 years, their numbers have been flatlined. Even some of them have even decreased the number of seats. So people are not interested in access. They're not interested in rights for everybody. The most elite people in this country work to make sure that the advantages stay advantages for their children. So while we are passing laws, we got to remember that these laws was passed, when my dad used to always say, with blood in the streets. People died for these laws to get passed. People just didn't wake up one day and say, you know what, we're gonna pass the civil rights. No, blood in the street led to these laws. And we still have to fight today to make sure that we get the access for everybody that everyone deserves. So the obstacles are everywhere. The obstacle starts from the local level to the state level in terms of what's happening across this country. They are passing laws against teaching African American history.
Right.
And we know that if I don't know my history, then I cannot push back against something that you're doing today because I don't even understand where we come from.
Right, back to burning books, the whole, right.
So
Yeah.
everything we do will have obstacles in our way, but it's what we do to move them out of the way, right? And I mean, like you said, Dr. Mackie, obstacles are going to be everywhere. It's the action, it's the, continuing the fight. So I truly believe that we just have to keep pushing and challenging folks.
And that's why, I used to, my grandfather used to always tell me, he said, boy, don't pray to God to move the mountain. Pray to God to give you the strength to conquer the mountain, because the mountain is always going to be there. And we have to make sure that our children have the strength to fight the obstacles that they, a lot of us want to believe that those obstacles are not there. And we have to make sure that we're giving our children the skill sets, the assets, and a mindset to overcome the obstacles that's before them.
That's right.
Correct. So let's move over to the next question that I have here. So at STEMconnector, we focus on how employers can be effective and perpetual partners in support of equity-based STEM education and workforce development efforts. Can you speak to how this role has evolved and continues to evolve from where you sit?
So I think, again, one of the things I think about are fear. And let me say, sadly, I think people confuse equity with equality, and they are not the same. And I say it's fearful because Heather McGee wrote a great book about the sum of us and the zero-sum game, and how many people think that by increasing equity means that it will decrease opportunities for them. And one of the cases that she mentions in the book is the whole swimming pool situation, how because African Americans could not swim in the public swimming pool, they closed the pool, filled it so no one could swim in it. And that didn't, just negatively impact African Americans. But that meant that the whole community had no pool, and of course, as we know, it's not like, swimming in a pool is going to change any part of you as long as the pool is kept clean. So I think part of to your question, how it's evolved is understanding the difference between equality versus equity, and addressing fear. One of the things that for me, I talk with friends about is how, after the murder of George Floyd, people came and asked different questions about how you feel, what do you think, and things like that. We kind of commented, all the time, really, all the time we have to. And so it is all the time. So in that regard, all the time, we must at all times be a part of the movement, the struggle to address equity.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah.
So we're talking about workforce and the evolution of the workforce. One analogy I like to use, when corporations start talking about employers and future employees and the future of work, they talk about a lot of times the school system, like it's the school system's responsibility to develop employees for them, and that wasn't always the case, right? Mm-hmm. Education was supposed to be about the human being, teaching the human being to be. I talk about STEM as a way of being and STEM as a way of doing. We put so much effort right now in making sure children and students and workers can do that we forget about their being. So the evolution we have to go back to, which the Historically Black College have always done, and what Dr. Ford was talking about, when they walked in, they made sure, they were like, how are you? They made sure you was okay. And even though, like, I went to Morrison studying remedial reading, when they dealt with my being and made me whole as a person, then I believed and then I could do. So the evolution got to be going back to the being and the doing, and that's where the belonging and inclusion come to. If it's just about workers and robots and people showing up and doing a job, that's another thing. But, you know, in order to get the best outcomes we need, people have to work together. An analogy I like to use also in the evolution of workforce and the thinking that corporations need to have about the workforce, especially in this day and age, is that workforce development got to be cradle to career. I mean, the things and the skills that our children would need in the 21st century got to be a part of their lexicon coming out of the womb. And corporations have to play a role in that. And if they don't think they have to play a role in that, they need to go visit the NBA and the NFL. Because the NBA and NFL make sure, especially every black and brown boy touches a football or basketball before the age of 4. And no one questions that. The NFL and the NBA make sure that in every community, there's a basketball court and a football field, and the kids got access to football and basketball, whether they get it at school or not. And with 3,000 universities in this country, guess what? They never have a problem finding boys to play football and basketball. And guess who never had a workforce problem? The NFL. So corporations have to make sure that they're investing. They got to take a long-term approach to workforce and begin to invest from cradle to career to make sure that all communities got access to high-speed internet and things such that kids can develop the skills that they need such that when they get to the end, they'll be employable.
I love your saying cradle to careers, and we all have to play a part, and we all have to work together to achieve definitely the workforce development piece. So I agree. So I'm going to kind of shift myself over to Dr. Norfles, right? So I'm very familiar with the TRIO Upward Bound program at North Carolina A&T University because my daughter attended there years ago, and several of her classmates were enrolled in the program as first-generation college students. What I learned from the program through the eyes of the students was that it was definitely an environment that nourished their interests, motivated their achievements beyond their expectations, and supported them to believe in themselves. TRIO programs can trace their roots to the passage of the Higher Education Act of 1965. These programs represent significant infrastructure in the form of policy. What role can federal policy play in advancing equity in education? Here we go. We are really kind of focusing on this equity piece. So advancing equity in education.
Well, I think to understand the TRIO programs is and how they move through policy, to your question, and equity is like, that's history in and of itself. So you had, again, so you had the reauthorization in 1968 and the grouping of those initial three programs as the TRIO of opportunity. So later in history, you had the 71 reauthorization, 72 reauthorization, and then you had in that an organization of professionals, TRIO professionals, started in Southwest Association, Texas area, Louisiana, and then to the Northeast, that organized themselves so that they could then meet and represent themselves with congressional members. You had Dr. Mitchum, the founder of COE, who then understanding, you know, and getting some real time with Representative Shirley Chisholm, who gave her instruction, who provided her instruction to him that, look, if you want this to happen so that it has some longevity, she introduced him to Congressman from Ohio, who then helped him Lou Stokes, I might say, Congressman Lou Stokes, who then helped him understand how it's done. And so the appropriations, Congressman Lou Stokes was the first first African-American in the Appropriations Committee in Congress. And so they worked together to create language that then could move TRIO appropriations, you know, higher so that more individuals could be served, more programs could be funded, and more individuals, more participants could be served. Now, in 80, must have been 80, what also happened in Congress was the realization, just like today, that anything surrounding race-based is not going to last, okay? There are different perspectives of equality per se, as opposed to equity. And so the language that was then added to the reauthorization of 1980 for TRIO programs was to serve low income and first generation to college, which made it appealing, particularly to congressional members. You had a congressional member who worked with, out of Detroit, Congressman Ford, whose aide, Dr. Tom O'Lannon, who happened to be the person that referred me to COE, who was first generation to college. And you had that same situation with number of members of Congress. So that resonated, first generation and low income. And then in, it must have been early 90s, you had a TRIO alum, an individual who was participated in the TRIO Upward Bound program from Texas, Congressman Henry Bonilla, a Republican, who then partnered with Congressman Lou Stokes to author legislation that supported the programs and increased appropriation. So to your question, some of the history when it comes to Congress that makes it important in terms of moving equity is working both sides of the aisle. TRIO, we like to say, is bipartisan, all right? We have an impact in terms of, as Dr. Mackie said, local communities, congressional members can see the benefit to their constituents. So it's to their advantage to want to support and advocate for programs that support low-income, first-generation participants in their districts. And so that also then ushered in the growth of the program. So there was the Veterans Upward Bound program that came in. There was the Upward Bound Math Science program, which came. And also just to demonstrate how bipartisanship works. When Ronald E. McNair was killed in the shuttle disaster, it was, I believe, Senator Paul Simon from Illinois that was going to initially structure a bill that would create kind of a post-baccalaureate program for SSS students. Senator Strom Thurmond called Dr. Mitchum and Mrs. McNair, the widow, because he wanted the bill to add Dr. McNair's name to it, so it would be known as the Ronald E. McNair Postback. And Strom Thurmond, okay, South Carolina for real, with a Democrat. So the policy piece, the connection, the ability to build alliances, to build a coalition, is major when it comes to moving legislation, to supporting programs that are going to benefit, a variety of needed constituents. I think I answered your question.
Yes, you sure did. Appreciate that.
Certainly.
So let me lean over to Dr. Mackie right now. I just wanted to share some of the highlights that you shared with the audience at the beginning of the webinar. So STEM NOLA was founded in 2013. You're at your 10-year anniversary last year, right? The program specializes in designing and teaching project-based activities and providing hands-on learning to expose, inspire, and engage students regardless of their socioeconomic status. STEM NOLA has impacted more than 125,000 children and 5,100 schools across the US and in 5 countries. So you guys are global. All I can say is wow and congratulations, Dr. Mackie.
Thank you.
Is it a fair statement to say that access to high quality STEM learning experiences is not equally distributed across society? Your work is aiming to correct this imbalance by increasing access for students who might not otherwise have it. Can you talk about how your work is reaching students across the country and what the potential impact could be?
Thank you, Renee, for those kind words and for the question. I'll never forget when I was 9 years old, my uncle visited from California, and he and my dad both had picked cotton in the South. He migrated with the migration pattern to California. He came, he and my dad, he was my godfather, he and my dad in the corner drinking their libations, and he brought me an erector set. And while they were sitting in the corner telling their lies and laughing, I built a little car. and a car ran across the floor, and my uncle jumped up and said, that boy's gonna be an engineer. At the time, I didn't know what it was. I couldn't spell it, had never met one. But I sit here today on this webinar with 3 engineering degrees. And I say that because my sons grew up in a house with a father with a PhD in engineering, a mother who's a pharmacist. And when they wanted an engineer at school, I would go, they wanted a pharmacist, the mom would go, they wanted a doctor. My friend would go, when they wanted to meet an astronaut, I called Dr. Jeanette Epps, my friend, they met an astronaut. They woke up every day with a picture with them with Obama hugging my kids, right? So they have social capital and they have access other kids don't. But when you start thinking about Jose, Mary, Puka, and Ray Ray on the other side of town who don't have that social capital, what about them, right? When you look at robotics programs and they say we need volunteers, the schools that have robotics programs are the schools with kids who parents, usually have engineering degrees who can volunteer. But what about the other side of town? Mm-hmm. And that's the majority of our children, regardless of their race. They don't have access to these people.
That's right.
So we built STEM NOLA to marshal the human capital and the technical capital into those communities to hopefully give these kids the access and the social capital that my 2 kids got it automatically. So we have these big events, and we say what we've done is that we built a high-functioning STEM community where we focus on K-12 kids. We just started our toddler corner. So this year we instituted a toddler corner where a mother or father can come, because a lot of parents have 2 kids. One may be in 1st grade, and we saw parents sitting on the side holding a toddler. So we hired an early childhood organization to come in and engage the parent and a toddler. And we scaffold the kids K through 2nd, 3rd through 5th, 6th through 8th, 9th through 12th. Then we surround those kids with college students who we pay. And we want to pay the college students because we want them to show up, right? Because college students, they may show up one day then. Okay. So we pay the college students. And then we surround the college students with STEM professionals, and they volunteer. And we partner with corporations like Chevron, is a big supporter here at the Gulf of Mexico Business Unit, have been at the table day one. Our utility, Entergy is a big funder. Boeing is a major funder of things that we do. Mm-hmm. So we realize that no, most communities do not have access to high quality STEM education in school, and especially in the community. And when you look at summer camps where kids are paying $3,000 or $1,000 to go to summer camps, how can kids on the other side of town even afford it, let alone understand it? So we need corporate support to create the environment so all kids can have access to STEM in school and out of school. And that's what we do at STEM NOLA. We bring STEM to the community, and we bring high quality STEM to the community. Last summer, we had 55 weeks of summer camps. We engaged over 3,700 kids in summer camps, from hands-on STEM to food science, we had a artificial intelligence camp. Now the adults ask, and they say, but can you have a camp for us? Because what you taught our kids, we don't know. So, that is what's needed in all communities, because there's a thirst for what we've proven is that there's a thirst in the community for this knowledge. Many funders say we're not going to fund it because they don't want it. And I said, they don't want it because you never served it to them. And if you put it on the right plate and you serve it in a way that they can digest it, I promise you they'll eat it. And that's what we've been doing, and the community in turn has responded, and they're demanding more access to high quality STEM education. They're getting it in the community, and now we are transforming the schools because parents know what their kids are not getting and asking the schools, how can I get this in the community, but I'm not getting this in the school?
It's really giving everyone a fair shake of the hand out in our communities, right? Giving them access. Access is everything.
But access to the people and access to the technology, right? We're bringing high quality. But when we have these events, the professional volunteers come out, and now people see this just not a Calvin Mackie thing. They got other Black engineers in the city. They got women engineers in the city. Little girls meeting people. When we have our heart and circulation day, parents crying because they see their daughter dissecting a sheep heart with a woman cardiothoracic surgeon, and they're imagining this could be my daughter one day. And they realizing these people that's doing this amazing work, they're not aliens. These are real people. And the kids are meeting, and then the mindset and the aspiration for the kids change.
So inspiring. let's just talk about this, because I know this is a hot topic across the board, and I wanted to bring this question to allow our expert panel to kind of chime in. You know, DEI programs are being cut across the country. What does this mean for higher education? Do you think these efforts represent a real threat to advancing the aims of the Civil Rights Act and equity overall?
Yes.
I
Dr.
mean, it's clear and present. It's a clear and present danger. I mean, and that's why they put it. I just spoke to the, I guess I don't know if I mentioned it. This past Monday, I spoke to the University of California Black Administrators Conference, 300
Sure.
Black administrators across the state of California. And I
Mhm.
started off saying DEI must die. And the DEI I'm talking about is discrimination, exclusion, and inequity. When that died, then we can have a conversation about killing diversity, inclusion, and equality. When I even explained it in terms of the first law of physics. First law of physics say a body in motion will remain in motion unless acted upon by some force of equal and opposite. Well, we know discrimination hasn't stopped. We know inequalities haven't stopped. We know inclusion hasn't stopped. So how can we talk about reverse? Because the first law says in order for it to go in reverse, it has to cease to exist.
That's right.
And it's a clear and present danger. It's a threat to the success that has been made. There was even an article on Sunday about Trinity Private School in New York, one of the oldest, most prestigious private schools in America. I spoke there last year, where these parents hire these consultants to write the perfect Ivy League essay. And one company they highlighted, has a tremendous record of getting kids into Ivy League schools. And the title of the article is called Writing the Perfect Ivy League Essay. And this consultant said a parent at that school, after paying him $100,000 to work with his kid, offered him $1 million not to work with any other kid in that class. Now, if this person is that committed to disenfranchising the other rich kids in his rich kid class,
Wow.
what you think this is all about? Right. Yes, it's definitely a threat to the progress that we've been fighting for the last 50, 60 years.
Right.
Agreed.
Mm-hmm.
So we're at 60 years out from 1964, and we all know that there's still a lot of work to do. I think, Dr. Mackie, Dr. Norfles definitely provided us a lot of information and context about the work that needs to continue, right? What would you tell the members of our audience if they were to ask, how can they support the vision of this landmark legislation?
I'd say the lesson has been, I think this is one of those physics or math terms, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts.
Yep.
And so collectively, we can do more. So we have to, when I was a student activist, one of the things that we used to hear on a regular basis was organize, organize, organize. Yes. So we have to organize. Mm-hmm. And organization isn't just one entity. It involves collaboration. It involves alliance building, connecting, STEMconnector. So it involves all of that. So it's recognizing that we can do more together and being intentional about that interest. Yeah. And let me also say to one last thing, to remember, okay, Reconstruction and Jim Crow were not that far away. Looking at the flow of history, it's not like we do not want to end up with what happened 100 years ago, all right? So if we are going to be more intentional, if we want to make a difference, we have to also remember history so that it does not occur again.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Mackie, would you like to add?
Yeah, no, Dr. Flores took all my words. They're my words. Them words like history and intentional and consistent and organized. Them my words. You know that those are my. But you are spot on, right? I mean, we have to be intentional and consistent about the action that we bring to the table. Now, the problem is not everybody want to have a panel. Everybody want to have a podcast. People want to write a paper about the work. People want to talk about the work. They want to meet about the work. People want to have a conference about the work. They want to break out in committees about the work. Then they have a readout about the work. Then they say we're going to do a strategic plan about the work. Then we're going to do another conference. But they want to do everything but the work.
Right.
The work is what got the civil rights legislation of 1964 passed. The work is what got us here now. And the lack of work is the reason why things are being taken away. Because people talking about it and people refuse, one, to sacrifice. People died in the street, sacrificed for us to be here. Now the people who are on the inside won't sacrifice to make sure that the doors stay open so people after them can come through. I mean, Maynard Jackson said 3 things. He said 3 things we got to focus on is the book, the ballot, and a buck. So we got to continue to learn. We got to definitely continue to vote. And we definitely got to continue to save our money and invest in things that otherwise are going to transform our communities and, you know, in our children. And we got to be intentional about the things that we do. In the 21st century, because this is called STEMconnector, and I just want to bring it back to the STEM. In the 21st century, our children are only going to have 3 options. And that's going to take something, break something, and or make something. And if we don't give them the education, the inspiration, and the motivation and the access to make something like make a living, make a life, make a difference, they're only going to leave them with the 2 options that we see on the news every night. And that's our responsibility. Everybody on here, you got 1 of 3 options: your time and or your talent and or your treasure. Right. Please give at least one of them to something in your community so that we can make a difference.
Indeed.
Can I also say to that point,
yeah,
with the youth, we also have to remember we were youth at one point. And so to have patience and grace to help guide them, you know, sometimes they think they know it all, but they are really out there. And, you know, respecting the elders, some may not have learned that lesson. So to help guide them, we have to have that grace as well, to give them that insight. So yeah, doing the work. Thank you.
You know, this is a great conversation. I can go on and on and on today, asking more questions. I'm looking, I know we're almost at time. I'm trying to go through the chat to see if there's a question in here. I see the chat is so active today, so I'm really excited. I want to say that there is a question in here, and I want to take the time to make sure that we ask it. How do you reconcile the efforts? So Norfles, this is for you. How do you reconcile the efforts today by our elected officials at the local and national level of whitewash history?
That's nothing new from what happened in the past. I mean, again, the Reconstruction era. All right, the Reconstruction era, you know, ushered in laws that, you know, provided African Americans a vote, you know, and opportunities. And, you know, 30 years later, we had, you know, Jim Crow laws that, you know, prohibited African Americans from gathering, from voting, you know, had the voting poll taxes. So, you know, to whitewash history, you know, and to eliminate history is nothing new. Even the development of, you know, some of the books, you know, and let me back it up a minute because I'm getting a little bit excited, so I've got to slow down.
Take your time.
One of the things that we have to consider is the proverb about not hearing the story about the hunter and the lion from the lion's perspective. So it's important to understand how history is used for power, okay? and how important it is for us to research, battle, and confront different perspectives of history. And so in terms of national and local levels, to burn books, eliminate history as it is, it's kind of the same situation with, during Reconstruction and the, what do they call it? The lost cause. And so it's important to understand how it's used. And let me say it this way too. I always think about, anytime someone says, well, that didn't happen, or, how we recognize African Americans that, Benjamin Banneker in terms of, science and history and astronomy and math. If people don't know, they don't know. But all the time, I have to be present to any challenges or questions that come my way. There's a book that Anand Giridharadas wrote about, The Persuader, that speaks to how if we are on purpose and intentional about changing things, sometimes we have to listen and understand a person's argument or perspective to make it personal, to be able to have patience and grace, to see where their heart is, to address what their fears are. There's a quote that I used when I was working on my doctorate. No power so effectual, no passion so effectually robs the mind of all its power of acting and reasoning as fear. And fear is a powerful passion. And so we have to recognize people sometimes operate from fear, again, what they will be missing, what they cannot get. And so that's how we have to approach, perspectives, the work that we do, and national and local politicians are people just the same.
Absolutely. There's one more question, and I want to definitely stick this one in before I close out. So this is for you, Dr. Mackie. Outside of STEM NOLA, do you have any recommendations for organizations, for those of us in New Orleans, to get more involved in that would support the goal of access, equity of all of our community?
Outside of STEM NOLA, I mean, there are many organizations, from the Urban League to Youth Force NOLA to even right now the NOLA Coalition, where they brought a whole bunch of organizations together to come together and discuss and implement things around social justice, especially for youth who otherwise don't have the support and the guidance. So a quick Google search would definitely lead you to many organizations in New Orleans that's doing that type work, especially now, post-COVID. But if you go to GNO Inc., Greater New Orleans Inc., which is the economic development apparatus here in the city, they have something called the NOLA Coalition, and they have a list of organizations like YEP, like Son of the Saint, but they should be listed there, and you can find the one that fit you and get busy.
Well, before we close out, I would be remiss if I didn't mention our next webinar. February is also CTE month, and we have a webinar about advancing CTE programs. More information will follow in the coming days, so stay tuned and register ASAP. Next month is International Women's Month, and Million Women Mentors will be delivering another dynamic webinar on how state, national, and international leaders with PepsiCo and Women in Insurance initiatives will be advancing and embracing girls and women in STEM fields on March 8th at 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Please register ASAP to mark your calendars now. To close out our program today, I would like to thank you all for attending. We hope you have learned and enjoyed today's presentation. Thank you, Dr. Calvin Mackie and Dr. Nicole Norfles, for providing us with a fantastic, impactful conversation. Let's continue to do the work that makes a difference in the lives of those that have the power to change the world with just our support. Have a great week. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, and thank you all for that. Thank you. Thank you.